Let me put this on record to the cloud. All right, so any thoughts or comments? Anybody want to chime in, give us any feedback, or if you're one of the people that I've chosen to expand upon that, or I hope I'm doing that just to give you a sense as to what I'm looking for, and these four were clearly of that ilk. So any thoughts or comments, young environmental people? All good. Okay, cool. All right, so let's keep going here. So I ended yesterday morning, we looked at Gapminder, right? And I showed you how those bubbles representing the various countries change over time. And I think that for me, the take-home message there is that simply that things are getting better, right? I said at the outset when we first got together on Tuesday that it is perhaps tempting, and perhaps many environmentalists do this, right? Is they tend to be sort of a bit gloomy. They tend to be sort of glass half empty, that things are getting worse, pollution's getting worse, we're running out of resources, we're changing our climate, and so on. And for sure, there's a number of really serious and significant problems that we face that are going to need to be solved by bright young people like you. But at the same time, I think it would be doing you and, in fact, the general population a disservice if that's all we put forward as the narrative, right? As opposed to sitting back and saying, well, some things, and maybe a whole bunch of things, are getting better. I can assure you the air quality in the United Kingdom now is much better than it was in the 1950s. Right? The air quality in the northeast of the United States now is far better than it was in the 1980s and 1990s, and we'll look at that. Situation with the stratospheric ozone hole is much better now than it has been in the last 2 decades. There are environmental success stories, right? Since the first Earth Day, when we had 2/3 of our water in the United States was not really safe for fishing and swimming, now the vast majority of it is. Right? So, things are getting, I think, in many ways and in a lot of areas, better. And here's an example of that, right? When we look at the evolution of society, okay, and so what this is showing here is, the current 7.6 or so billion. So this infographic came from a paper in 2018 when the population of the world was about 7.6 billion. Now we're at about 7.8 billion, right? And so what this interesting study suggests or shows, I think, without any shadow of a doubt, is that we are experiencing now this ongoing shift, and in many parts of the world, this rapid shift from people coming out of poverty and moving out of what we call vulnerable populations, and there's various ways to define that, into the middle class, right? So when you add up the numbers here, right, there's 3.8 billion or so people that are in the poor and vulnerable. That's an enormous number, about half the population in 2018, and there's 3.8 billion that are defined as middle class or rich. If you're interested in the quantitative numbers here on how we define these, I can certainly send that to you. For example, extreme poverty, remember, by the World Bank, is less than $1.90 per day, right? Vulnerable people live on between $1.90 per day and something like $11 per day, right? Middle class are $11 per day to $110 per day. And you're probably thinking, well, if I'm earning $20 per day, how can I be middle class? Well, in some parts of the world, you would be, relatively speaking, okay? So it depends on where you are, right? How we consider ourselves well off or not. But there is this rapid movement, and it's shown by those sort of figurines at the bottom here, okay? About one person escapes extreme poverty every second on this planet. That's awesome, right? About 5 people are entering the middle class, right? Those 5 little figurines entering the middle class. And yeah, the rich are getting richer for sure. I'm sure you've seen all the discussion around that, right? About we need to tax the rich more. But the rich are getting richer at a smaller rate, right? So the middle classes across the board really are growing. And that's a good thing. I don't know if any of you, and I certainly wouldn't, argue that one of the ways to improve our environment and correct things is to turn that around and have everybody run from the rich and the middle classes back into vulnerable populations and into poverty, right? That, I mean, ethically, that would be unconscionable, but it wouldn't make much sense anyway, right? And so why do we talk about this in a class and the environment? Well, as people move into the middle class, right, they consume more, their tastes get more expensive, perhaps they start taking on Western diets and need more meat, and so on. So their human impact on the environment becomes more acute. I hope that makes sense to everybody, and please, chime in if you agree or disagree or have a thought or a comment on that. But I think at least this is what the data is showing, right? And I generally don't use, as I said when we first met, slides that have lots of text. So this is an interesting quote from a report that was done on poverty in 2018. Those in the middle class have some discretionary income that can be used to buy consumer durables like motorcycles, refrigerators, washing machines, and so on. And go to the movies. They can take vacations. They're reasonably confident that their family can weather an economic shock. They are consuming more, okay? And that consumption comes at a cost. What's it going to look like by the end of this decade when we get to 2030? Well, again, this is just a projection, but it looks like by 2030, we are going to have far more people now in the middle class and the rich. So you add up those numbers, 5.3 billion, 2.3, that's 7.6, and you add another 300 million, that's 7.9, 450 million. We're going to be at about 8.3 billion or so people by the end of this decade. And this is more or less what it's going to look like, right? That light blue line is going to get bigger and bigger. So any thoughts or comments on that? Or does that seem pretty straightforward? Anybody want to chime in? I want to give you the opportunity to do that. Silence. Okay. All right. So if we just think a little bit more about population here, and if we start from this premise that things are improving, that we've seen a dramatic decline in total fertility rates, right, from 5.5 to 6, 50 years ago, where total fertility rates are about 2.5. I don't think there's any argument that that is a good thing, at least from a consumption perspective and the ability to give people a life of dignity. The growth rates have dropped dramatically around the world, all right, tied to the total fertility rate. And the question is why, right? Matt raised that question either yesterday, probably yesterday, if I remember correct, about what are these underlying factors. Well, I think there is a consensus here. There is a broad agreement that when we look at the underlying reasons why we've seen such tremendous inroads into things like global fertility, right, where our population growth rates are now declining, and all indications are that growth rates are moving downwards. Remember, even though we are inevitably committed to another 2.5 billion people because of the age structure of global population, I think it comes down to these 4 factors. This might be an oversimplification, but from what I've found and read, I think this makes sense to me, right? So one is infant mortality is down, right? Health and human services have improved. That's one of the early stages through which societies develop, okay? And I'll talk about that. I'm going to tie that concept in right at the end of the course. But one of the first things we see as a country or a region moves through this transition to a fully developed market-driven economy is that people live longer, right? Children survive. Infant mortality goes down. So people don't feel the need to have lots of children. We don't need as many children for work anymore. We're moving away from the rural farm towards, industrialized city centers. Number 3 is absolutely fundamentally important, right? Women getting into the education and labor force, okay? So women's rights, which are still under attack around the world, for sure in many regions, but that is changing, thankfully. And of course, family planning, right? Accessibility to birth control. Those 4 things, which are interrelated and playing out across the global stage, have all, I think, led to this dramatic decline in total fertility rates that we've seen and are likely to continue. All right, so let me just stop there for a minute before we go on to food. Any thoughts, any comments? I'm going to have to start picking on people, which I'd rather not do. But anybody got any thoughts or comments, or is everybody happy on those fronts? All good. Okay. All right. So if we draw a line here and say, okay, that deals with population dynamics and some global demographics, what is the bottom line to population growth? What area is one of the great stresses, right? Well, this is going to be one of the great stresses, okay? And that is, as population continues to grow, despite declining fertility rates, as we start adding this 2.5 billion people, remember, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South and Southeast Asia, how are we going to feed them, right? And environmentally linked to that, what does expanding agriculture mean to environmental degradation, to our environment, right? And one of the themes, or one of the concepts that I talked about in the very introductory meeting on Tuesday, right, is that 1 in 5 people don't have access to electricity, 1 in 7 are hungry, right? I mean, round it up, round it down, 1 billion people go hungry, okay? So why is that, do you think? Why are people hungry? Is it because we don't produce enough food? Do we need to expand our food production? Or what do you think's going on here, everybody?
Could it be that overproduction of land is like making it less arable?
Say that again, Cole?
The overproduction of land is making it less fertile.
Oh, okay. So land degradation, right? Yep. That is certainly part of it.
I thought hunger or famine was caused by political interaction.
Oh, keep going, Ahmad.
Can I phone a friend?
Say again?
May I phone a friend?
Is that your final answer?
See, yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, so there's an argument that we actually produce enough food, right? And when you look at a place like the United States, where something like 1/3, maybe more, of all our food gets thrown out, you kind of stop and scratch your head and go, wait a minute, right? And there certainly is evidence that we produce enough food, but it's the inefficient delivery and political systems and corruption that hinder the actual, transport and delivery of those basic needs to the people who need them. Is that what you're kind of intimating, Ahmad, that it's a breakdown in the political structure that gets food to the people who need it?
Exactly. Well articulated. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. You've used your lifeline, but thank you for that. Yeah. So, do we produce enough food? Yeah, probably. Okay. And how do we produce it? Well, here's one of the challenges, and this begins to, I hope, build upon Cole's point, right, about overproduction and a reduction in things like crop yields, right? How much food do you produce from a particular region? Okay, so I love this diagram. You'll see a lot of, well, maybe not a lot, but you'll see several of these types of diagrams as we go through this course, right? Big global pictures. And this is a global picture of the percentage of our land that is either in pasture or cropland. So the colors here, as you move towards the top right-hand corner of that triangle and you get into the reds, that's showing more land under pasture. And as you get down towards the greens, that's showing more land that is straight to growing crops like corn and maize and wheat and barley and cereals and grains and those things, right? Now, obviously in the grays here, we've got some tricky areas, okay? So it's important to note that. So there's areas in northern Canada. This is the tundra, the Brazilian rainforests over here, the forests of Central Africa, obviously the Sahara, the Great Deserts, ice caps, and so on, right? So we have to, we have to be careful here and say how much of our terrestrial surface is farmable, right? But when we look at those areas that are farmable, I think this paints a pretty dramatic picture, right, in terms of cropland and pasture. So so this is actually, these two numbers are worth remembering, or I'm not going to necessarily ask you to regurgitate numbers, but think about this just for the moment. We currently have about 1.5 to 1.6 billion hectares of land that is under cropland, right? So this is a unit I want you to be familiar with, the hectare. So how much is a hectare? Because we're going to come back and talk about this with deforestation. We're going to talk about it with land degradation. So let's get that out of the way. Now, I know you folks are yards and inches and Fahrenheit people, as I am to some extent. But when it comes to measuring land area, we use the hectare. And a hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters, right? 100 meters by 100 meters. If any of you follow American football like I do, that comes down to 2 football fields minus the end zones, right? So a hectare is something like 2.2 acres, if you prefer that unit. So just to try and give you a scale, right? So a hectare is a couple of football fields, more or less. So when we look at the amount of land that we have under production in the world, about 1.6 billion hectares are croplands, but about 3.5 billion is area that is under pasture, right? So when you look at the majority of Africa, right? Now, this doesn't imply that there are no croplands in Africa. I'm just talking about the overall relativity and the scale, because remember, as we get into the lighter browns and the kind of grayish area here, that's a mixture, but you can clearly see most parts of Africa, right? Parts of Australia down here. Okay? When you look at parts of the US and certainly in parts of South America, pasture dominates, right? This in the US, well, that green's not going to work, let's use red. Here in the US, this is the breadbasket of America, right? As we go up through the Midwest into the farming areas, you can see most of Europe. Look at India, for example, huge areas of cropland. So the take-home message here is that of the areas that are farmable, we've pretty much got most of that already either in crops or in pasture for grazing, for sheep and cattle and so on, right? So right off the bat, everyone, as we start thinking about a growing population and feeding that growing population, one of the issues that comes up immediately is, okay, even if we produce enough food right now and we've still got 1 billion people going hungry, maybe we're going to need to produce more. And oh, by the way, as we bring another 2 billion in, maybe we're going to need to produce more of that as well. And so the question is, how are we going to do that? Well, one possibility, of course, is just to expand the area that's under cropland or pasture. Well, what are the implications of that? Well, if you need more areas to expand agriculture in South America, for example, here's a nice area that we could go into, but that's tricky. In chapter 7, we're going to talk about deforestation, right? And what that means and how that's devastating forests across Latin America, but essentially focused a lot here in South and Southeast Asia, right? So yeah, there's not a lot of land out there just sitting available for us to, put under the plow. I guess that's the take-home point I want to make at this juncture. Any other thoughts or comments on this map? Right?
We're eating too much beef.
Well, we're gonna make that point in the next slide, right? Yeah. So 2/3 of all our land goes to raising cattle, right? So why is that a problem? Why is it a problem, Matt?
It's a misappropriation of the land. It takes too much energy output.
So it takes a huge amount of energy output, right? So I've tried to capture this from a paper from the Union of Concerned Scientists in one of these infographics. So let's see if this works, okay, more or less. And I don't want to get too bogged down here in percentages. So some people say that we've got 25% of our area under cropland. Some people say 30. Let's just take it at about 1/3, 30%. So this is an interesting infographic. This data is not mine. It's from a paper from, as I say, the Union of Concerned Scientists. But I think it summarizes the point that cows are the real hogs when it comes to when it comes to food. And again, I'm not a vegetarian, right? On Saturday evening, I made a nice 10-ounce filet for me and my wife, right? Now, as a environmentalist, people will probably go, wait a minute. You know, how can you stand here and lecture about cows being the real hogs when you're eating meat? So that's something that we can chat about. So here is the percentage of area in agriculture. Cropland, about 30%, right? Grazing land, about 70%. Okay? That's the previous diagram in numbers, right? 3.5 billion hectares in pasture, about 1.5 to 6 billion hectares in crops. Now we can measure energy flow, okay? If you study thermodynamics, you measure energy flow through systems, okay? So how is energy measured? Well, what's going on when you're growing, you know, corn or wheat, or when you're putting land under pasture and you're growing alfalfa grass? Where is the energy? It's chemical energy through photosynthesis, right? So those crops are growing as they absorb sunlight, and through photosynthesis, they produce carbohydrates and sugars within them, right? That's biology 101. And we can express that energy, so that's the second part of this diagram, as the percentage of the biomass, right? As the percentage of the biomass. So when we look at cows, for example, down here, right? So here's a cow, okay? Cows will eat presumably all of this grazing land, 70% of the alfalfa grass. But remember, cropland, not all of that cropland goes to producing cereals for human consumption. There's a large part of it that also goes to growing grains so that animals themselves can eat, right? Concentrated animal feedlots. So cows overlap. They take a huge amount of energy in terms of the biomass from grazing land and also from crops that are grown to feed cows. So when we express the energy consumption as we move down through various ecosystems and organisms here, it's estimated that cows, as a percentage of the biomass, consume about 86%, right? They are extremely expensive from an energy perspective to raise, right? Huge amounts of water are needed to grow the crops and the grass, right? And then they consume a huge amount of the biomass. But here's the problem, and I think that's tied up in your comment, Matt. The amount of actual food, consumptive food in terms of meat and protein globally is about 8%, okay? So you go, wait a minute, right? The cows are using or consuming 86% of all the energy that's available, right? In terms of biomass, but are delivering 8% of the food. Okay? It is an extraordinarily inefficient system, right, to do. So plant foods, which constitute about only 8% of all of this biomass, in other words, all the grass, the alfalfa, the grains, the wheat, and everything that's grown, plant food, which constitutes about 8% of the energy flux, produces about 85% of the food itself, okay? So that just doesn't seem to make sense in terms of the delivery of food, right? To continue to, especially to you know, to plant grains and then to feed those to animals. So Matt, does that kind of illustrate what you were, you know, what your comment was in terms of the inefficiency of energy through the food system?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that like pigs and chicken only take up 3% of the energy, but they almost produce the same amount of food worldwide.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's kind of like you have to look at like what's the actual pros and cons of it.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely, right. And so, you know, couldn't agree more. And you know, and so people say, well, you know, we need to eat much less red meat, and what would that do in terms of the environment? Well, you know, that would absolutely help. People have meatless Mondays. Obviously, you take it down that line to become a vegetarian or vegan, whatever the case may be. But my concern, and again, I am a meat eater, but my concern is, yeah, as you start moving societies into the middle class and they start taking on Western diets, they're probably going to want to eat more meat. Okay, so what does that look like in terms of environmental degradation? So that's the problem. Again, I can't preach to anybody. I can just, try and be objective and look at this from a thermodynamic perspective. So when we think about food, okay, how do we create a sustainable future as it relates to food? Because remember, we are going to have another 10 billion people, right? Is it 10? Is it 10.2? Is it 10.9? Let's just say it's 10 by 2050. And the UN, remember, says 10.9 by 2100, right? But for illustrative purposes, let's just call it 10 billion people by 2050. Estimates suggest, through a number of recent studies, and I've taken this from papers in Nature and Science, that we're probably going to need about another 50% more food, right, to feed the world in 2050. Here's our food in 2010. We're going to need to add about another 50%, 56% on top of that to feed 10 billion, right? How do we do that without using more land? Right? How do we increase our food gap? And that's what it's called, the gap that will exist between how much food we currently produce and how much we're likely going to have to produce by 2050. How do we fill that gap without consuming more land? Okay, and consuming more land suggests that in order to do that, we may have to put another 600 million hectares into production, right? Now, there is a lot of work that is done on this. There's a lot of controversy about, are we really going to have to increase food production? Some people suggest it's going to have to double. That 56% is far too conservative, that we're probably going to have to double our food production. Others suggest that we cannot do this without going into tropical rainforests to increase our crop yield. So this is well, it's a little more than conceptual, right? But it's a graphical way to try and simplify what is going to be, what is, and what's going to be a very complex problem, right? So we're going to have to somehow decrease that food gap, produce more food, but how do we do that without completely messing up the environment, I guess, is the take home. And so this one here, this slide here, is going to be the sort of final way for me to contextualize this, okay? So here's a question from Claire. So if we stopped eating beef in general, would that provide enough hectares to produce more food? I think the simple answer, Claire, is absolutely. Yep, absolutely, because you would then start capturing a far greater percentage of that biomass, right? And so the question is, well, why don't we just do that? Right? Why don't we just all stop eating beef?
Is it just self-interest of, like, even though we have the information and everything?
McDonald's still needs to make their money.
Mm-hmm. So self-interest, Matt, you made that comment about self-interest when you and I were chatting after class, right? So yeah, and then you've got the beef industry, right? Which is a gigantic industry around the world. So if we just say, okay, we're going to shut down all beef, then what happens to all those livelihoods and farms in these regions? Tricky. Yep. Not easy, right? So what I've tried to do here, and this is my diagram that I've tried to, it looks, it's a complicated one, but here's what I've tried to summarize all of this, right, as a kind of take-home diagram, and that is, what choices do we have in front of us in terms of the human dependency on land? And so we've got three things on this diagram here, right? So let's just look at these axes before I explain this diagram. Cropland in billions of hectares. Okay, remember we currently have 1.56 billion hectares of land under crops. Okay, so we're right in here. So this axis right there is billions of hectares of cropland. This one in here is population in billions. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. And then the axis on the right here is the arable land expressed in terms of how many hectares per person on the planet, right? So that's just taking the total cropland, 1.56 billion hectares, and dividing it by the population, 7.5 or so billion people, right? How many hectares do we have effectively for each person on the planet? Okay, so let me take this step by step. So this curve here, these vertical sort of lightish brown bars that go up to 2018, because that's the latest data I can get my hands on. That shows the arable land historically from 1960, where we had about 800 million hectares under production, more or less, up to where we currently are, 1.56. Remember, we get much more accurate estimates as we come through the more recent past, where we're able to look at high resolution mapping from satellites, right? So you can see that from this little diagram, from the arable land diagram, let me just find my mouse, that from about the mid-1980s onwards to about 2010, it's pretty much a flat curve, right? Not much change. We haven't been putting really effectively much more land in under production. And from about 2010 onwards, we've seen this increase, right? That's been manifest as deforestation, right, in certain regions. So that's the land currently in use. The green line is population, right? So here's population up until 2018, and here we are at about 7.5 billion people. And the red line here just shows, of course, as population goes up, then the arable land per capita comes down. So in 2018, we are at about 0.2 hectares per person, right? That has been continually decreasing over time. The actual physical area of land that we are using to grow crops, not pasture, just crops, right? I hope that makes sense to everybody, okay? Now, of course, to a large extent, that shrinking of the arable land that's available to us has been offset by efficiencies, right? The green revolution, okay? Decreasing what we call not just that crop gap, right? But increasing the amount of food that you're producing per hectare, right? That's also called yield. And so, for example, in many parts of the world, and let's take the United States, we have highly mechanized, highly industrialized, and many would argue highly efficient agriculture. We produce a huge amount of food on per hectare relative to other parts of the world, right? So that's built in here. But the point of me doing this diagram to sort of round out this discussion on population is where to now, right? As we go through to 2050, what are some of the options in front of us as we move through 2050? Well, here's one of the things we know, right? We know that this is going to happen. We know that population projected through to 2050 is going to be something like another 2, maybe 2.5 billion people, given everything that we've said in terms of age structure of current global populations, right? So what can happen here, okay? Well, we've got a couple of scenarios, and just take a look what these little circles are doing. We know that, or let's assume that the amount of land under production, let's just make an assumption for a start. And let's make that assumption that the amount of arable land under production stays flat, right, through to 2050. In other words, we come back and we say, we are not going to go into rainforests. We're not going to put any more land into production. Okay, that's one scenario. Okay, we also know that global populations are going to go up, right, to 9 or so billion people. If that scenario happens, then there's no other way out than to show that the arable land per capita is going to go down, right? I mean, it's a zero-sum game, okay? If our current arable land stays the same and our population goes up, then the land per capita has to go down. There's no other way around it. And the question is that significant? Does it make a difference if we have 0.2 hectares per person? In other words, if we have about 1/5 of those 2 football fields, is that significant if we go down to 0.15? Well, probably, right? Of course, there are other scenarios here in terms of the environment. You know, one of the scenarios, as you look at this diagram, is that, okay, if we want to keep the arable land at 0.2 hectares per person, then why don't we just do this? why don't we just follow line B and put more land under production, and in fact go across to about 1.8 to 2 billion hectares per person? You know, what's the implication of that? Well, the implication is we don't have another 400 million hectares of arable land just beautifully sitting there saying, hey guys, come on down, you know, put us under the plow. That means we're going to have to start pushing into more marginal areas already. Does that diagram make sense to you? Okay, you'll probably see this next week on Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock at exam number 1 in some form. Mahela, thumbs up, good, okay. All right, so that's the challenge, right? An enormous challenge. There's so, you know, in the chapter in the book talking a little bit about waste, it's exasperating, it's catastrophic how much food goes to waste, right? It's spoiled in transport, it goes off, we just throw it out. I'll never forget it. The first time I went to dinner at the Cheesecake Factory, it just blew me away. I love the Cheesecake Factory. I don't know if any of you have eaten it, right? You go to the Cheesecake Factory and they bring this menu and there's about 8,000 different things to choose from. Okay, and I don't know why they just don't bring a to-go box immediately, because any entree at the Cheesecake Factory, which again I love, all right, seems to be enough to feed a family of 4. So, you know, what does that say? Do we eat far too much? Or our consumptive lifestyles just chronic? Because the picture I'm showing you here is a picture that I'm familiar with, right? Having been born and raised in South Africa, clearly into a life of some privilege. In South Africa, when I was, you know, born into this bubble, kind of apparently protected by apartheid, the government institution, you know, millions of people didn't have access to things that I had access to. And that scenario is played out around the world, right? And we have to find a way, I think, I know, we have to find a way, ethically, morally, to make sure that people don't go to bed hungry at night. I just find it extraordinary in 2021 that's the situation that we have, but we do. So let me stop there before I get too lectury. That brings a close to chapter 2. Thoughts, comments, questions? Matt, I know you have family in the food industry. Is there anybody else who has family or works in nutrition or the food industry that would want to chime in or think about that? Feeding the world. So all of that, everyone, will now play out as we get a little deeper in here and we get to later on and we get to things like climate. You'll probably think, hang on a second, what's the link between food and climate? We'll make that link when it comes to carbon, but certainly in terms of deforestation, habitat fragmentation, land degradation, and water supply, right? Agriculture in the United States is the second largest consumer of water, by a long way beyond anything that we do domestically or for mining or anything like that. Okay, only behind power generation. But water is a critical resource, and how's that going to play out as we have to feed another 3 billion people? Any other comments or thoughts? Let me stop the share there for a minute. All right, cool. Okay, so there's population. And how are we doing? 8:45. I think that's good. That seems like a good stopping point for a cup of coffee. So let's do a little 5 minutes early today. Let's do 8:45, and we'll come back here at about 8:55. 10 minutes or so. We'll have a little break, and then we will get onto the material in chapter 3. We're going to start a large section here in terms of energy. All right, I'm going to put the. All right, everybody. How are we on time? 8:59. All good. Okay. So let's change gear here and now move into what's going to be a pretty extensive section on energy. And the overall focus, of course, will be on the environmental impact of our search for energy. But before we get started, let me just ask a question. Let me poll you and see, are any of you, or do you have any family that are in the energy business? Any of you have experience in sort of quote unquote the energy game? I'm just trying to get a sense as to what, you know, what the backgrounds of you are as it pertains to any energy. Anybody work in the energy field or have family directly involved in energy? Must be.
I work in oil and gas.
Okay, O&G, good. So Nicholas, say that again.
I work in oil and gas. I'm a mineral acquisitions landman for a company here in Fort Worth.
Very cool, awesome. I'll be drawing on your expertise as we go through this. We've got someone in O&G. Anybody else in the energy game? All right, Nicholas, you'll be giving us the lecture on fossil fuels. No, cool. So let me tell you a little bit about how where I come from in terms of energy and how I want to navigate this material. So I may have mentioned this, forgive me if I can't remember, but in 2008, I started what ended up being an 8-year research project on the integration of wind energy into our, not just our grid, but into our landscapes, our communities. A large energy company out of Florida that had very extensive wind assets here in the United States wanted to expand their development of wind throughout the Midwest, starting in Texas and moving up through to Iowa. And prior to doing that, what they were really seeking, and I thought this was kind of an interesting approach, is they were seeking some guidance based on the science behind integrating wind into the grid. How much can you get in? What does that actually mean in terms of carbon and our climate? How do we go into small communities and kind of address some of the concerns about wind energy? How do we deal with things like intermittency and transmission? How do we deal with things that relate to the impact of wind farms on flying things, right? How do we deal with things like visual pollution? How does the money really flow when you put a wind farm in a region? Who gains and who doesn't gain, right? So it was a very broad set of socioeconomic, ecologic, environmental questions that they wanted answers to. And the cool thing is that I got to lead it here out of TCU. We had eventually, I think, 9 different institutions involved in the research, both international and here, some from the Midwest, some in California, National Renewable Energy Lab. So I mentioned that just simply to kind of, again, try and be transparent that I have a fair amount of experience in the renewable space, less so in the oil and gas space. But of course, Texas is largely an oil and gas state. And so how I plan to navigate the discussion on energy, as I mentioned in our very first meeting, is this is absolutely not going to be, well, we are an environmental course, and so what we're going to do for the first half is bash oil and gas, and then for the second half, we're going to promote renewables like wind and solar. That's not my goal, and I think that would do a real disservice, and it wouldn't, it's against how I teach anyway. So my goal here is to kind of give you, I think, an objective view on all of these generation technologies, right? Fossil fuels, nuclear, renewables, biomass, and talk about, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Talk about what's good, what's tricky, and how we may want to do things differently moving forward in terms of our energy portfolio. You know, the giveaway, I guess, the spoiler alert up front is that, as you would imagine, there is no silver bullet here, right? There is no single technology that we can instantaneously overnight transition to that will give us clean, affordable, environmentally benign, efficient, safe delivery of energy, whether it's energy that we put into our vehicles or energy that, you know, that we put into our home. So I hope I'm able to do that and to be objective go through this. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to talk this morning about context, right? So this will be a lot of context and background and some common themes to energy. Then we're going to deal with fossil fuels. We'll deal with nuclear, and then we'll look at renewables, and then we'll tie this up. Again, always with a view towards the environmental impact of our search for energy. I guess I need to figure out how to turn the volume down on my phone. All right. So I'm going to start with this picture. This is obviously a picture of some wind turbines here taken in the Midwest. It's not my photograph, and I'm going to use it as a background to frame this discussion with two questions, right? If we just think for a moment about wind energy, renewable energy, okay. So one of the questions is, are we destroying the planet to save the climate? Okay, so think about that for a minute. In other words, I don't know about you, but I often hear the conversation around energy relating to carbon, right? And Nicholas, I don't know if you get this in your work in oil and gas, right? But the focus on climate deals with, we need to decarbonize our economy. We need to move away from fossil fuels. And we need to deploy as much renewable technology as we can, like wind. Question is, are there unintended, maybe intended, but are there unintended consequences to our planet in order to just simply decarbonize, right? Hopefully we'll get an answer to that as we go through these next two sessions. And the second one is, can we really abandon fossil fuels? Right? At least in the short term. And when I say short term, maybe, let's say 1 to 3 decades. Or if we reframe that, how much energy or how much electricity can things like wind turbines realistically supply? Okay, so I don't know if you've ever thought about those questions. Nicholas, I don't know if you've thought about those questions in your day job. But those are two that I like to kind of get people to just ruminate over, right? Do we have blinkers on if we're just focused on a renewable perspective? And how long are we committed to fossil fuels for, right? Because I think, at least in my circles that I hang out with, I think there's a naivety to some extent when I hear the argument that we need to go 100% renewables immediately, right? We just need to. It's simple. We just need to go wind and solar and be done with it. Yeah, that's tricky. Why is that tricky? Why do you think that at the moment in 2021 is a naive assumption? What do you guys think?
It's difficult, and there is a lot of money and economic ramifications to doing that.
Okay, keep going.
I am on board for full transparency on my end. I am fully on board to eventually transitioning to 100% renewables as quickly as possible, just based on what I've read. But it is naive to think that we could do it immediately. I used to be somebody that was like, let's do it now. And then you have to understand how these kind of systems work, and that it's not going to be easy to simply get people on board with that. People who run these oil companies, people who support the fossil fuels industries, and then politicians who take money from the oil and gas lobbyists. There's social and economic ramifications to doing it so quickly that I think I agree that it is very naive to think that we can do it quickly.
Okay.
We could phase it out. I don't know about a 100% transition even over a couple decades.
All right. Interesting. Nicely articulated. Anybody else want to jump in here?
I think because we've sunk so much into gas and oil that switching immediately is difficult just because like everything currently is operating on those systems.
Mhm.
I don't really know how else to put it.
Yep. Okay.
I think you have to look at also the financial implications of trying to move solely to renewables. I mean, just like in Texas alone, it's multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's not feasible to move to renewables, I think, in the next 50 years completely. Nor is it feasible to move to renewables completely. I mean, because they're not controllable sources of energy. When the wind isn't blowing, are you making wind energy? Obviously not.
Not that I know of. Yeah. So let me just touch on a couple of points there, Nicholas. So I agree with you, and it's such an interesting point, right? Because I hear that a lot. I hear, and again, just in the spirit of transparency, I teach a course on the environmental issues surrounding energy in the Energy MBA in the business school. And I hear that a lot, right? I hear that, well, listen, when the wind doesn't blow, you don't generate electricity. And when the sun doesn't shine, the solar panels don't work, you know? And I think we get that. You know, it's like, okay, when it's dark, solar panels, they're not really efficient, right? It's kind of the nature of the game. And I don't know if it was you, Nicholas, or someone else, Cole, we have to appreciate right off the bat, right, that renewable technologies like wind and solar are what we call non-dispatchable, right? They are intermittent. That is the nature of the game, okay? They're non-dispatchable, meaning that if we suddenly this afternoon, right, let's say we go back, and I'll talk as we get deeper into this, I'm going to talk a little bit about Snowbird in February and what happened here in Texas, right? But let's say you have a situation like that, right, where you have a very rapid and unexpected ramp up in demand, okay, whatever that is. Let's just say we need another 10 gigawatts of electricity right now by midday, okay? And let's say this is a pretty quiet day in terms of wind, and we've got lots of cloud out, and the solar panels aren't operating at maximum efficiency, okay? If you want to go 100% renewable and you're just relying on those two, then you're going to have to be comfortable with either sitting in the dark or keeping your thermostat off, right, to ramp up your air conditioning. They are non-dispatchable. So when I turn the switch on in my room here, okay, if you're solely dependent on those and they're not delivering, and we're going to talk about storage and put all that aside, you have to have dispatchable resources, right? You have to have a technology that can supply what we call the base load, right? And not only the base load, you have to have something that you can ramp up and ramp down. Now, that doesn't mean to say that renewables like wind and energy are a failure. Not at all, right? I will show you and explain why later on. There's no doubt that we are going to continue to ramp up wind, because wind currently supplies something like 20 to 22% of all of our electricity in Texas, right? It's not this kind of funky, hippie, weird technology that we're still coming to grips with, right? We fully understand how they work, right? The challenge is we've got a grid that was designed by Edison, right? We've got a grid where you build a particular technology, like a coal-fired power plant, right? All of the electricity is generated there, and then that's distributed out to a grid. Oh, and by the way, we're using a 19th century technology to boil a pot of water, i.e. coal. I mean, in 2021, that just boggles the mind, right? But it's very, very complicated because there is so much infrastructure, there's so much money tied up. We are such a consumptive society when it comes to electricity, and that's just the United States, okay? I'll never forget, I was at a conference in Abu Dhabi, at an energy conference, and the Minister for the Environment for India was talking, and he said, you know, so it was a renewable energy conference, and he was talking about, you know, the challenges and so on. And he said, let me just tell you folks, right? I have to get electricity to 600 million people. Think about that, right? I have to get electricity to 600 million people who currently don't have it in India. How am I going to do that? Can't afford to build a nuclear power plant because, as we'll talk about next week, the economics of nuclear power currently just simply don't work unless you have catastrophic subsidies, right? So that's not going to happen. So what powers development in the developing world is coal. The environmentalists all put up their hand and say, no, 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 we don't want coal because that's the most polluting environment, okay? They don't have natural gas resources, okay? So it starts becoming a very, very complicated game when you're looking at regions and countries and what does the geography, what is the energy geography of that particular region supply, and how do you build that into a grid, okay? So a comment here from Errata, some of the renewable energy resources also have their own negative environmental impacts. 100%. Every single generation technology has a negative environmental impact. Couldn't agree more, right? What we're going to look at, Errata, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and please tell me if I'm not, what we have to look at is we have to lay that all out on a table and say, okay, here we have coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear, biomass, wind, solar, and so on. And we put them all out on the table. Now we have to start balancing that, right? We have to start balancing costs, environmental costs, cents per kilowatt hour, subsidies, politics, lobbyists. It starts becoming very, very complicated. Any other thoughts or comments? Does that make sense? So this is a fascinating topic to me. I love this section on energy because it's not only critical in terms of the environment, but it touches so many things that we do. Okay. So we'll come back and address those questions a little later. So let me start with this diagram just to get some terminology out the way. I'm going to use, like they do in the scientific literature here, I'm going to use the term reserves and resources very specifically. So I just wanted to point that out. Sometimes these are used interchangeably, and some people use them a little differently. But I'm gonna use them specifically here because what we have is that when we go after a technology, let's say it's an extractive industry, right? And let's say we're looking for natural gas, right? We're looking for natural gas fields. Anything that plots up here in the top right-hand corner, right? Which is on this top scale up here in the highly profitable. In other words, we can extract it and get it to market and sell it at a profit. And we know exactly where it is. It's mapped, we know how deep it is, we know how expensive it is going to get out of the ground, right? If it's an extractive resource. That's known as an economic reserve, okay? We know where it is and it's currently profitable. It's an economic reserve. Anything else in here is a resource, right? Those resources we may know exactly where they are, okay? So you may have a resource that's right up here in this corner here. We know it's exactly where it is. And let me use an example sitting right under our feet here. The Barnett Shale, right? You've probably heard of the Barnett Shale. Nicholas, I don't know if you work in the Barnett Shale or that particular area, right? So here's a geologic deposit of shale that contains oil and gas, and it contains huge quantities of gas. We've known it's been here for a long period of time. Best known, mapped, depth, we've known it's here. But it wasn't until the mid-1980s when a technology came along, right? A combination of technologies called directional drilling and fracking, okay? Where you could drill down into a deposit, turn that bore and go horizontally, okay? And then you could pump water and some sand and some chemicals under very high pressure and fracture or break the shale, right? Just think about dropping a big block of glass on the floor and the gas flows out of it, right? That changed the economics of a resource that we knew to be under our feet and shifted it right over here into the reserves, meaning it became economic to mine and get it out. So just bear that in mind as we go through here. And I hope I may make the odd mistake and call something a reserve when it's a resource and vice versa. And of course, these things are in flux, right? You can have a reserve, you know where it is, and it's currently profitable. And then something happens to the price, right? Like the price of oil, which is highly volatile in and of itself. When oil is $130 a barrel, hugely profitable, right? When oil here is $20 a barrel, people walk away. Can't get it out the ground and sell it at that price. Does that make sense? So, you know, reserves and resources fluctuate across this two-dimensional space. All right, so I just wanted to get that out the way. Okay, so let's look at the current situation. So currently, when we look at the global energy portfolio, right? And this includes fluids for transportation. So I'm going to make a very clear distinction when we talk about that versus electricity. This is the global energy portfolio, right? We currently get about 85% of all our energy needs worldwide from fossil fuels. Okay, so this may speak to Jacob and Nicholas and Cole here, right? You know, 85% of all of our energy needs globally come from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have driven the Industrial Revolution. How do we suddenly put a big X through that 85%? We don't, right? So again, that's the kind of the spoiler alert. We're committed to fossil fuels for some time to come. So just breaking this down, about a third of all our energy needs comes from oil, okay, and subsequent petroleum products, right? So crude oil is then refined into a number of different petroleum products like jet fuel and so on. So you can see that fully 1/3 of all of our energy needs comes from oil, right? 27% of all global energy needs comes from coal, and that number is changing dramatically. So coal has been again, the fuel for the Industrial Revolution. China has built its economy on coal, as has many other countries, and including the United States, right? But that is changing dramatically, which I'll share with you as we go through this. Natural gas, 24% of the global energy demand, right? So there's the 85% right off the bat. And here are the others. Hydro, okay, various forms of hydroelectricity accounts for about 7% of the global energy portfolio, nuclear about 4%, and renewables, and those renewables are a broad scope of solar, wind, biofuels, biomass, and other things that are built into what we think of as being renewables. Okay. So that's the challenge, everybody, is that from an environmental perspective, right? And your comments are well taken here. How do we take that? I guess this is the key question. How do we take that 4%, that green slice? Is it realistic to go to 8% in the next 5 years or 10 years? Is it realistic to go to 20% or 50%? Okay, we don't know, right? But it's going to take time for sure. So that's the picture. I don't know if you had any comments or thoughts on that. So we'll use that as kind of the scene setter, if you like. All right. Here's another one of these little diagrams I've come up with to try and illustrate some things. Okay, so we've got 2 axes here. I always like doing graphs that have multiple axes. We've got a couple of axes here. So this shows proven oil reserves, okay, proven oil reserves. Now that term, having just said resources and reserves, I'm gonna have a caveat here. Let's just hang in. Proven oil reserves as of 2018 in billions of barrels, okay? So that's the left axis here. So down here, proven reserves, BBLs, right, in billions of barrels. On the right axis, and the right axis also refers to the numbers on top here, right? So 17.2, that is the percent of the global total. Okay? The percent of the global total is what those numbers actually mean. And I've chosen 3 countries here for a specific region, and I've scaled these countries, you know, the size of those countries are relative to one another, with the 2018 estimated reserves. The United States of about 70 billion barrels, Saudi Arabia, 297, right? So here's Saudi Arabia up here, 297, Iraq, 147, Iran, 155. This is the kind of graph that I love to put into an exam. And the question I would ask is discuss. Someone talk to me about that. There's a bunch of things tied up in this diagram. 2018 proven oil reserves. Anything wrong with this picture? Anything right with this picture? What comes to mind when you see a diagram like this, everybody?
I guess something that I'm thinking of is how large the reserves are for like Venezuela and Canada, and you don't really talk about them. you're usually talking about like Saudi Arabia or like Iran being like the big oil players, but
Does that
Venezuela,
surprise you?
yeah, I'm just surprised that Venezuela surpasses Saudi Arabia and
Mhm.
Canada surpasses Iran.
Yeah, surprising, right? I'm glad you've spotted that. Most people would think Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and then some other players.
I think you look at it from another perspective for Venezuela is that they have this huge oil reserve, yet the economy and the people there are suffering and have nothing. And they're
Isn't that
all
crazy?
They're like gas down there because I traveled to Venezuela to play baseball as a young child, and gas there was like 4 cents, but no one had cars.
Right, right. What's wrong with that picture? Yeah. Yep. There's something. Yeah. So that's cool. Let's just look at Venezuela for a second here. There's something quite unique about the Venezuela situation and the Canadian situation here. And it's probably why it's surprising to you, Cole. The reserves in Venezuela, and that's why this is going to seem like I'm just going to totally contradict myself here for a moment. But the oil reserves in Venezuela are a particular type. Anybody know what they are? It's a particular type of oil reserve, okay? And it is called an oil sand or a tar sand. Anybody heard about these? Oil sands or tar sands. Not absolutely all of them, but the vast majority of them. So oil sands and tar sands, we'll talk about next, well, maybe tomorrow. No, not tomorrow, that's Saturday. That's not gonna happen. We'll talk about that on Monday. Oil sands and tar sands are deposits that we call unconventional reserves or unconventional resources, okay? Whether they're economic or not. Unconventional meaning they're not sitting in a pool of oil as we traditionally think of in a geologic deposit, okay? This is oil that is contained in very, very tiny pore spaces, in sedimentary sequences, in sandy deposits, right? Oil sands. If you were to scoop out a tar sand or an oil sand, you'd get a big clump of sticky, sandy, goopy stuff that you could probably make a little statue out of, right? But it's extremely hard and expensive and energy consumptive to get that oil out of the tar sand. These are not conventional reserves. So a conventional reserve would be an oil rig sitting in the Gulf of Mexico. You drill down into the deposit and you pump it out, you suck it out, right? So the reserves in Venezuela and Canada are unconventional. They're in these tar sands, right? And the reason why I say I'm going to contradict myself is that at the moment in Venezuela, they are not economic to extract. Okay, so are they technically reserves? Well, I suppose that would be proven oil resources and reserves. Right? And in Venezuela, they sit in a sand belt called the Orinoco, right? So if you took those sandy oil tarry sands off the picture, then yeah, coal Venezuela would go and it would sink down. Actually, it would fall off this diagram, right? Venezuela wouldn't be a player here because their conventional reserves are small, like Canada, right? The majority of Canada's oil is sitting in the tar sands in Alberta. And again, something we'll talk about because I'm going to make that link into the Keystone Pipeline and all of the controversy surrounding that, okay? Anything else on this diagram? Cole, did that explain that? Does that kind of, okay, cool. Anything else on the diagram? Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. Anything problematic there?
The geography, how close they are, and the tensions that's created over the years, and our involvement over there.
Yeah, right. I mean, we can't, we can't walk around on eggshells, right? These are geopolitically difficult places. Now, I haven't been to either. I've been to other Middle Eastern countries. But yeah, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Would we be, I don't know how to phrase this, would we be dramatically concerned about this region if there wasn't oil there?
Unlikely.
Unlikely, right? Unlikely. Saudi Arabia is very, very tricky one, right? Again, I haven't been there, so I can't talk from personal experience. But I do know they are an enormous ally in the fight against terror and an enormously important stabilizing force in terms of that. But I don't, are we allies with Saudi Arabia because of their exemplary record on human rights? Yeah, probably not, but tricky. Okay. Iran and Iraq, long-term geopolitical instability. Of course, we were in Iraq, and the cynic in someone might argue that we went into Iraq for the first place because of the oil. I'm not sure that's true, but would we have been there if there was no oil in Iraq? I don't know. My point simply is that these countries that have enormous reserves, you can see them on the bottom there: Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, right, Libya. Geopolitically conflict zones, yet they hold enormous power, right? Saudi Arabia is still the greatest oil power, at least in terms of OPEC. So OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and they control the supply, the production, and therefore the price on a global scale, still to a large extent, right? So that's problematic for sure, okay? Just as an aside, without looking anything up or asking Siri or Alexa, do we still import oil from Saudi Arabia, do you think?
Yes.
How much?
Not sure post-pandemic.
Say again?
I'm not sure post-pandemic.
Okay, just as a stab, I should have done a poll. How much oil do we import from Saudi Arabia?
Is it 7%?
Yeah, it's low. It's surprisingly low. It's probably 7 now. A couple of years ago, it was 9. I think there's this perception. I often get this, especially in a big freshman class. There's a lot of people that think we import half our oil from Saudi Arabia. We don't, right? And so you hear this comment a lot about we have to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. Anybody heard that phrase, right? We've heard that a lot. I think we've heard it in every single state of the union, whether it's a Republican or a Democratic president. We have to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. We have to become energy independent. And I'm not, I don't know about you, Nicholas, in the oil and gas industry, but I'm still not absolutely sure what that really means, to be energy independent in a globally interconnected world, especially with a commodity like oil. Now, if we're importing less oil, then yeah, logically, we are less dependent on a country like Saudi Arabia, right? So we do import oil from Saudi Arabia, and we import oil from a number of countries, okay? And you can see that on the next slide here, if I just go forward here. This is the 5 largest currently, again, these are 2018 numbers. These are the 5 largest sources of US petroleum imports, okay? And again, just be aware that we're talking, so there's 2 terms here. There's, we pull crude oil out of the ground, and then we produce a number of different petroleum products from that. But look at Canada. We currently import 43% of our imports, of petroleum imports in the US are from Canada. Okay, I don't think Canada is going to invade us anytime soon. They seem to be pretty friendly up there, so it's economically stable, right? But if you look at the little graphics that I've put down on the right here, okay, only about 4 of, you can see, of those billion barrels there, right? So Canada has about 167 billion barrels of oil, if you go back to the previous diagram. So the maple leaf shows about 167 billion barrels of oil. Only about 4 of those are through conventional drilling, right? The rest is all in oil sands. That's extraordinary. And we'll see what the environmental impact of that is down the line, right? So we get 9% from Saudi Arabia, 7% from Mexico, Venezuela, Iraq, and so on. So we import petroleum products from a number of different countries. And interestingly, the US is a major exporter of petroleum. And you go, wait, what? Hang on a second, how can that be? Why are we importing and exporting? Isn't it one or the other? Surely we are either importing oil and producing petroleum, or we're exporting. Why do we do both?
Make money off the yields for selling it.
Yeah. Oil companies are not 501(c)(3) nonprofits, right? And our refining in the United States, my wife's from Houston, and if you drive down through, the Bay Area and Pasadena down there and so on, those refineries there are really the most sophisticated in the world. And so when you look at this diagram here and you say, okay, we're importing a large amount of oil from Canada, the vast majority of that is heavy crude, right? Heavy meaning thick, dirty crude. And the same with Venezuela, right? We can buy that heavy crude, refine it, okay, into petroleum products like jet fuel, and export it at a profit, if that makes sense. So the US is both an importer and an exporter, and we need to bear that in mind. And I'll show you some of those numbers as we play out. Okay. So again, just to bring it back to the context here of electricity, right? There's about 1.5 billion people that don't have electricity. And I want you to bear in mind, everybody, as we begin to move through this material on energy, and as you read through this material on energy, just don't forget and bear in mind that this broad brushstroke of potential solutions and environmental impacts is very different in different parts of the world, right? So the challenges that we face here in the United States in terms of the generation of electricity, very different to the challenges, my family and friends in South Africa face, and different to people in Somalia or India or wherever the case may be. And I'm going to use this just to illustrate this theme of the haves and the have-nots, right? This is another cool website. It's actually linked to Gapminder. And this is a website called Dollar Street. So if you are bored one afternoon and you want to go down the rabbit hole of Dollar Street. It's really cool. These are actual families. And I'm just giving you a snapshot of 3. And you can pick on a family and then actually go virtually into their house and meet their whole family. And it's really neat. And along the bottom, I've just got 3 arrows here. This is an economic spectrum, right? So here's a family. This is the Batoy family. And Imelda is a farm laborer. She's 41. She has 4 children, lives in a small 2-bedroom house. Their most favorite item is their cattle and their clothes. Their dream is to be able to buy a house. They live on $27 a month. Okay? Their energy needs are not the same as mine. Their energy consumption is not the same. The way in which they generate their power and what they use for cooking and so on is different than mine would be. Here's the Lagarde family in the Philippines, right? He's an airport staffer. She's a service operator. They are parents to 4 children. The next big plan is buying a car. They also dream to be able to own a house. They live on $865 a month. And then here on the right-hand side is the Larrière family from the great country of France, okay? They're struggling through on about $20,000 US a month, okay? They like their surroundings. They dislike the tourist activity. Their favorite items in the house are their artwork collection. The next big thing they plan on doing is to go on a trip to the Himalayas. And they're not, they're happy with their house, but their dream is to buy a chalet in Switzerland. Okay? So my point is not to disparage any particular group or point fingers at any particular group, but just to acknowledge it is what it is, right? And there is this production, but consumption spectrum that plays out in terms of energy and electricity, right? And so we have to look at that and figure out how to manage that as we move forward and deal with things like food and so on. Here's another way to look at it, okay? I modified this from an online presentation from someone who I admire greatly, and I can send you the link to him as well. But here's a way to contextualize global energy supply problem, if that's a way to look at it. We'll start in 2010, when, remember, 2011 is when we went through 7 billion people. So the figurines here each represent 1 billion people on the planet. And in 2010, this is more or less how the global population was partitioned. Okay, and the boxes, the black boxes, each of those boxes represents a unit of energy. So instead of actually putting up how many billions or of terawatt hours, this is simplified into of all the electricity consumption, all the energy consumption around the world. This is how it breaks down in terms of units. So in 2010, the world used 12 units of energy. 2 billion people lived on less than $2 a day, right? So that's the poverty line. And each of those billion that we see down on the left here, each of those billion consumed a half a unit of energy. Most of their energy requirements come from the burning of biomass, right? Burning organic material, wood, coal, and so on, okay? So that's 2 billion people, and they consume a total of 1 unit, 1/2 each. Here's 3 billion people sort of living in the, out of the kind of vulnerable, but certainly now moving into the middle classes. And they have electricity, right? So these 3 billion people have access to electricity, and each of them consume 1 unit of energy, and they're living on somewhere between $2 and $40 a day. Then we've got 1 billion people that not only have access to electricity, but they probably can afford washing machines, and they're each consuming, that billion are consuming 2 units of energy. And then there's 1 billion people down here, right? They not only have access to electricity and have washing machines and cars, but they probably take vacations as well. And that billion consumes 6 units of energy. So there's the 10s, there's the 12, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 2 halves, that leaves 12, right? Everybody see that? So that's 2010. So what happens from 2010 forward to 2050? Do things stay static? Well, of course they don't stay static, right? What happens? Societies begin to move through development phase. And the 1 billion people sitting here who have washing machines and are each consuming 2 units of energy are probably going to move to the right, right? So that billion will hop over to the right. And if consumption levels stay the same, they will each consume 6 units. The 3 billion who have light bulbs probably want washing machines. And instead of each consuming 1 unit, they will now each consume 2. And let's assume that the 2 billion who consume, they get their energy from the burning of biomass, and the 2 billion coming along, right? That will get us to 9+ billion people moving forward. Let's assume that they all want to move out of poverty and have access to electricity. The point here is that by 2050, we've gone from consuming 12 units of energy to 22 units of energy, okay? Well, can we take any of these units off the table? Well, we know that as we have continued to develop and derive our electricity from these various sources, that we have become increasingly more efficient. So the estimates are that we can probably take 4 of these units off in terms of just improved efficiency, okay? And so no matter how you cut it, by 2050, energy demand will have gone up by at least 1/3. So 12 units in 2010, let's say it's 18 units in 2050. And incidentally, Shell, British Petroleum, the World Bank, the United Nations, all of those estimates are now beginning to converge around about a 30 to 40% increase in the demand for energy as we move forward through to the middle of the century. And from an environmental perspective, I guess the key question is, how many of these units can we turn green, okay? Can it be half of them? In other words, will 9 of them be from fossil fuels and 9 of the units of energy come from things like wind and solar, okay? And coming back to our earlier point, right, and the comments made by, I can't remember exactly, but basically made by Jacob, Nicholas, and Cole, that it's not going to be 100% green, okay, unless there is some absolutely remarkable shift in technology, unless the hydrogen economy comes into gear and we can suddenly scale away from fossil fuels, and by 2030 we're all driving hydrogen cars and all of our electricity comes from hydrogen. It's not going to happen, right? The infrastructure will just simply not allow that. So that's the challenge from an energy perspective, right? Is not only another 2 billion people, is how do we get energy to them, right? How do we get that to them without completely messing up the planet in the first place? Here's another way to look at that, okay? This shows the predicted energy demand through to 2035. And let me just explain the axes here and how this has been developed, right? This also started in 2010 as the starting point. This unit here is MTOE. Don't worry too much about that. It's just a unit of energy. If you're interested in it, it's called million tons of oil equivalent, right? They could have plotted percentages here or any other unit. And the point here simply is that as we go from 2010 through to 2035, look where the demand comes from, right? The demand comes from China and India, at least the greatest growth in the demand, right? Other countries in developing Asia, countries like Vietnam, that have seen an incredible turnaround in their economies, and other countries that will go along those lines, right? OECD, does everybody know what OECD means? That's basically the quote unquote developed world. That's the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. You could probably think of it, you know, the G20, for example. You can see that the demand from the developed world, like the United States, it's pretty flat, right? So this here is going to be an enormous driver of not just carbon, but the energy transition, okay? And you can see that in this diagram here as well, right? So I've taken this as a summary. When we just looked at 2018, okay, the growth of primary energy consumption in 2018 was about 3% higher than it was in 2010. And you can see as a percentage where that is coming from, right? About a third of all of the increase in the demand for energy came from China. So China is an absolutely critical player in the generation and the consumption of energy and electricity. And really interestingly, I don't know if you folks are aware of this or have seen this, but President Xi from China 2 months ago put out a manifest and in a speech said that China will become net zero by 2060. In other words, their net carbon footprint will be zero, right? Currently, they're nowhere near to that because they get the majority of their electricity from coal. But he's made a commitment that in the next 40 years, China will lead the way and become net zero. Is that possible? How's the rest of the world going to follow? What will India do? Okay? Where will the US play out in that? So really tricky. Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to stop. There's a few more slides here, and I'll just bring those into the discussion on Monday morning, because now what we're going to do is we're going to shift to electricity, and we're going to look at the US for a minute, and then we're going to do fossil fuels. So we'll go through oil, coal, and natural gas. That'll probably take Monday, and then Tuesday we'll do nuclear and renewables. So questions, thoughts, or comments, everybody? Does that make sense? What we've covered? I think we're good for time, 9:47. But I'd leave just a few minutes here if there are any questions or thoughts or comments.